Hello and welcome to week 19 of history. We should have a fairly short week this week in terms of new content. I was thinking that the Norman conquest of England was in this next set of lessons, but it's next week, so that's where it really gets interesting as far as our history is concerned. Again, our focus is on Western Europe and the Norman invasion of England and all the changes that brought about there is very much a direct antecedent of us. But we do have some interesting stuff. It was funny last week in class when I assumed that everyone knew or at least had heard the name Eric the Red, and I was met by blank stares from everyone else. Well, now you can say you do know about Eric the Red. He was the Viking explorer who discovered Greenland after getting kicked out of Norway for killing a person and getting kicked out of Iceland for killing two people. Well, he had a son named Leif Erikson. Eric's son, get it? Anyway, the tradition holds that Christopher Columbus was the discoverer of North America, the New World, and all that jazz. Well, number one, Columbus never landed in America. He landed in the what we call the Caribbean islands, Jamaica and all that. And number two, about 500 years before Columbus, there was a European presence in what is now North America, and it was Leif Erikson. Now, for years, this was kind of considered legend. There were no real artifacts that prove this, just, Viking legend. But we now do have, really within the past couple of generations, archaeological evidence that Vikings did have a settlement in North America. It was in Newfoundland, which is a large island off the mainland of North America, Canada, but it is North America. And there were Vikings there. And we now have, like I said, in just the past 50 years, there's been archaeological evidence that prove the existence of Europeans, white men, if you will, that were in the New World, again, 500 years before Columbus. Leif Erikson, the legend goes, and again, most of what we have about Leif Erikson is legend. Again, his father was exiled from Norway because of a murder, but he evidently wanted to go to his homeland just to see what it was about. He was a very adventurous young man. While still a teenager, he was able to get to Norway and meet King Olaf. And the legend goes that King Olaf converted Leif Erikson to Christianity. And the legend further goes that when Leif Erikson returned to Greenland, he converted his mother to Christianity. Not his father. Eric the Red remained faithful to the Viking gods for the rest of his life. But Leif Erikson, by doing what he did, was able to spread Christianity in the world a little more. Much like Greenland was discovered sort of by accident by an Icelandic Viking who got blown off course, the so-called New World was discovered also by another Viking who got blown off course in another storm and evidently saw this huge coastline, never landed there, but came back and said, boy, they're further to the southwest here, there's a whole lot of land. And Leif Erikson was inspired by these stories and wanted to go exploring. Exploring was in his blood from his father. He actually persuaded his father, Eric the Red, to go with him. Eric was going, the legend goes that Eric was going towards the ship, but he accidentally fell off his horse, and he considered this to be a bad sign, so he never got on the boat. Anyway, around the year 1003 if you want to call it that, Leif Erikson, at the age of 21, boarded a ship with 35 other Vikings and sailed to the southwest. And the legends go that they probably landed on, first going directly west, they landed on what is called Baffin Island, which is one of the Arctic islands that is still technically Canada, but it's mostly tundra, uninhabitable. But as he went further south, he found much more habitable lands in what we now call Newfoundland. And he according to the legends, Leif Erikson and his men got out and, of course, found endless natural resources with trees, grass, fresh salmon, grapes, of course. So much so they called it Vinland after a vineyard. He and his men built sturdy shelters at a small settlement that they called Leesbudur, and they stayed there for the winter, then went back to Greenland to report about the new land that they had found. They also, at this point, it was much better for growing. They had, unlike Greenland, they had consistent periods of sunshine and dark. Lots of lumber again for shipbuilding, and the evidence suggests that they spent another year there, brought a bunch of supplies back with them to Greenland. His brother Thorvald went back to the New World, to Newfoundland, with 60 men, 5 women, livestock, and supplies, and they were intending on being a permanent settlement. Evidently, they fared okay for a time with the natives, the Inuit Indians. They traded things like dairy products and cloth for furs and wood. However, evidently, their relationship with the natives began to sour, and the natives were becoming much more hostile towards them. And after some time, they just decided it was best to leave, that they were not in any shape to live under this type of hostility. And there's no evidence that the Vikings ever went back to Newfoundland to do anything more than just go get some trees, basically. There was a endless supply of wood there. And they went back a few times, evidently, to get wood, but they never made another permanent settle. Sagas are full of interesting stories about the Vikings. Again, it's very hard sometimes to separate fact from fiction. But as recently as 1990, there have been archaeological discoveries of Viking artifacts in portions of coastal Newfoundland, which gave us, again, so really in just the last generation have we been able to get solid evidence that, yes, indeed, Vikings did discover, quote-unquote, North America 500 years before Columbus landed in the Caribbean. Next lesson is going to be about Macbeth, not the Shakespearean play, but the actual Macbeth, the King of Scotland, one of the kings of Scotland. And it's also a case study in how some figures are famous simply because there were things written about them. Our next lesson will be a little bit like that too, where the legend is much more entertaining than the facts. And unfortunately, the legend is what will live on, unfortunately, beyond the facts. But there was a Macbeth. He was in Scotland. Scotland, as we know, for the longest time was inhabited by the Picts and other, what we would probably call, what the Romans called savages, of course, pagan peoples. But Columba, the missionary that brought Christianity to Scotland in about 500 A.D., within a century or so, that region, Scotland, was producing some of the great Christian works of art. Some of the great monasteries that served Christianity were in Scotland, so it was a very much a Christian-driven region. Now, Macbeth actually started off as a sort of a greedy mercenary general under King Duncan of Scotland. As it turned out, he served King Duncan, but he wanted to be king himself. Didn't have any royal blood, but again, you can get kingships in other ways. At the Battle of Bullnogwan in 1040, Macbeth faced King Duncan to steal the throne of Scotland, and the legends go that he killed King Duncan by himself with his bare hands in battle. With this show of strength, he declared himself King of Scotland and remained in that position for 17 years. And despite the brutal way he got the throne, he was considered a fairly effective king, a good ruler. There was a problem, though. Duncan had a son who rightfully would have been King of Scotland if it had not been for Macbeth killing his dad. The son's name was Malcolm III, and obviously he wanted revenge for his father's death. So he teamed up with the leader of Northumberland, which is the upper part of the of the UK, south of Scotland, and they, technically speaking, beat him in battle. But even though they beat him in battle, they were unable to secure the throne from Macbeth. Sometimes warfare is not so cut and dried. Just because you won the battle doesn't mean you accomplished your aims. So, 3 years later, they attacked again at a place called Lumphanan, and Malcolm III returned the favor and killed Macbeth with his own bare hands in battle. And despite all that, he still was not functionally the King of Scotland. For a few months, Macbeth's stepson took the throne, but finally Malcolm got what he wanted. He ousted the stepson and made himself King of Scotland about a year later, and his reign lasted 35 years. So all in all, the time period before Malcolm III was quite turbulent. Before all of this happened, the book says from 844 to 1057, there were 12 assassinations over the throne of Scotland. Wow. Besides the fighting in the kingdom, of course, the Scots were under constant threats from Viking raids. It was centuries before we had great works of art from Scotland, because, again, you don't produce a heck of a lot of art when all of your day-to-day existence is bent on survival. Now, of course, William Shakespeare thought the story of Macbeth was the great basis for a play, and of course he wrote the play, and much like if we see a movie today that's based on a historic event, there's going to be a lot of fiction thrown in because the truth is sometimes very boring, and as is the you would think would be the case, William Shakespeare's version of the story of Macbeth includes a lot of stuff that never happened. There was no Lady Macbeth. There was probably a sort of a combination of two real women, but suffice to say, that is something else you're going to see a lot in history. Whenever there is a dramatization of a period of history, there's going to be a whole lot of inaccuracies, because sometimes the truth is not very dramatic and not very interesting to watch, read, or listen to. And the author of a play, the director of a movie, wants you to watch and listen to it. So there's going to be a whole lot of stuff thrown in there that forces us to work hard sometimes to separate fact from fiction. Kind of along the lines of Macbeth is El Cid. He was to Spain what Macbeth was to Scotland in some ways. Remember the kingdom of Al-Andalus, that little southern third of Spain that was Muslim when the Moors invaded Spain in 711 at the Strait of Gibraltar. They brought with them, of course, the Islamic religion, but they had a long period of peace there, a few centuries where there was some great art and architecture produced. Now, again, as we mentioned before, Christians could live there, but they were persecuted. They were tolerated, basically, and they did not feel very welcome in what was an Islamic majority, really an Islamic ruled community. Now, there was a large population of Christians just to the north of this in the Pyrenees mountain range that were sort of on the border of France. And in 835, the story goes, here we go again, that a shepherd discovered a coffin that had bones in it. Don't know how this worked out, but somebody determined that these were the bones of James, writer of the book of James, half-brother of Jesus. And all of a sudden, this spot in northern Spain became almost a religious pilgrimage, second in importance only to Jerusalem. It inspired thousands of Christians to come there, and as the number of Christians in Spain grew, came renewed passion to reclaim the entire Iberian Peninsula for Christ and not for Muhammad. Priests and knights rose up in arms against the Muslims, and from all this enthusiasm, Christian regions in Spain began to spread. By 1037, a couple of new Christian states, Castile and Leon, emerged, and later Portugal was established. All along the way, they called it the Reconquista, the reconquest of the Spanish Peninsula. It was a process that lasted about 450 years. It was kind of a mini crusades. We'll talk about the crusades later, but this was very much a crusade-like activity on the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal. And again, for several centuries, the Christians were pushing back against the Moors in southern Spain, and eventually, in the 12th century, more or less ousted them from the continent. El Cid was a Spanish knight at around he was born in 1040, so about 1070 is when he began to become a military commander of some renown. He began his military adventures fighting for the Christians in Castile. However, he was accused of stealing money from the king, and he was banished from Castile, and he sort of declared himself a free agent. Said, okay, whoever wants to hire me can have me. Well, for 8 years, he worked for the Muslim leaders of the city called Saragossa, and extended the Muslim territory, kind of a fight back against the Christians. Then, suddenly, in the year 1089, for what was called a fee of 10,000 gold dinars, El Cid switched loyalties again and led 7,000 men in recapturing the city of Valencia from the Muslim forces. So the money was right, and he turned coat on the Muslims and fought for the Christians. To secure Valencia, El Cid did a whole lot of brutal things. He burned the chief justice of the city alive. He then declared himself governor of Valencia, but sort of like Macbeth, despite the brutal way he obtained power, he proved to be a fairly good ruler and became a hero to the Spanish people. His wishy-washy loyalties were forgotten over time. When he died in 1099, his wife actually governed Valencia for 3 years. What happened, though, again, much like with Macbeth, after his death in the year 1140, a saint, actually a monk rather, wrote the poem of the Cid about El Cid's adventures. And it was, like Macbeth, it was highly dramatized, it was very, very kind to El Cid. It painted him as a great, great hero who helped Spain kick out the Muslims. Again, the truth is much murkier, as we've heard, but largely because of this poem, the El Cid is recognized as a hero of Christian Spain, even though for a while he was fighting against Christian Spain. As for the Spanish Muslims, again, during the Reconquista, the Muslims were pushed farther and farther south into Granada, Al-Andalus, and a couple of rulers named Ferdinand and Isabella finally booted them out in the year 1492, the same year that they commissioned a trip by this wild-haired explorer named Christopher Columbus. So we kind of come full circle here. Started off talking about Columbus, ended by talking about Columbus. We'll talk a little bit more Monday. We'll see you in class.